Have you ever wondered if the Italian Mafia ever had direct links to Mexican drug cartels? Well, according to this government report titled Organized Crime and Illicit Trafficking in Narcotics, commonly referred to as the McClellan hearings or the Valachi hearings, a subcommittee was convened in 1963 in order to investigate the Mafia's involvement in the international narcotics scene. The reports were unprecedented and would uncover a direct link between the Mafia and the Mexican drug cartels, a relationship that dates back to the 1940s, when the 107th Street Mob, also referred to as the Morello crime family, then controlled by one of the Mafia's original mustache Pete's, Giuseppe Morello, was said to have been the first official mob family to establish ties with Mexican drug traffickers for the procurement of heroin. But how was this Mexican connection established, and who was involved? Let's find out. I'm your host, Tony Hernandez, and this is Corruption Connection.
But we found there's a strong connection.
I would rather deal with organized crime than disorganized crime. Because in disorganized crime, everybody's out there doing whatever they wanted to do. In organized crime, only certain people can do it.
The Mexican drug cartels have been a dominant presence in the international narcotics trade for the last 50 years. From men like Miguel Felix Gallardo and Rafael Caro Quintero, to more recent notorious traffickers such as El Chapo Guzman and El Mayo Zambada. Their power has been permanently cemented in the underworld, establishing their role as the world's premier drug trafficking organization, enacting their brutal methods of violence and torture, intimidating rivals and setting a precedence for efficiently operating an international crime syndicate. However, this was not always the case. Prior to 1940, there was no heroin produced in Mexico. According to this report, Corsican Gangsters, who were the mob's original dope connection, had shifted their operation down to Mexico City.
You have a highly organized professional gangster group comprised by the Corsican Gangsters, who control heroin traffic. They're well entrenched in Marseille and Paris. They have many resources.
The Corsicans famously established an international heroin smuggling operation that smuggled heroin from Marseille, France to the United States via Montreal, Canada. Commonly referred to as the French Connection, it was one of the largest and longest-lasting narcotics trafficking organizations in history. If you're interested in hearing more about how the Italian Mafia made their French Connection, check out this episode I've done titled Biggest Dope Ring Ever, The French Connection, where I go into detail on how the Mafia's boss of bosses, Lucky Luciano, established a heroin pipeline from Marseille to New York back in the 1930s. You could find this video located under the videos tab on my page. I'll also post the video link in the comment section below. The original trafficking route for French heroin entering the United States was Canada, specifically the city of Montreal, where Franco-Corsican traffickers would connect with their American Mafia counterparts in order to smuggle the drug into the United States. However, when pressure from law enforcement, particularly the Royal Mounted Police, became too much to bear in the Great White North, the Corsican Gangsters headed south and moved their operation from Montreal to Mexico City. The report states, the importance of Mexico in relation to the illicit traffic in drugs within the United States is based on three factors. For many years, the bulk of marijuana distributed through the United States had been grown in that country and has been smuggled across many border points stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. During World War II, when the main supply of heroin from abroad was virtually cut off, the criminal element turned to Mexico, where there was some cultivation of the opium poppy, particularly in remote, inaccessible areas. During the early 1940s, conspiracy cases were developed, resulting in the conviction of a considerable number of members from the infamous 107th Street Mob, who set up a rather elaborate system for smuggling and distributing both crude opium and heroin harvested and produced in Mexico. However, with the cessation of hostilities and the resumption of clandestine laboratories operations in Europe, principally in France, Mexico, as Canada, became an important point of transit for European drugs being shipped into the United States. We estimate conservatively that 80% of the heroin which has been smuggled into the country from Mexico is not of Mexican origin, but instead is European. It is significant to note that the Corsican gangster element who control the laboratories in France set up headquarters in Mexico City, which corresponded to similar operations in Montreal, Canada. As a matter of fact, the same people in charge would shift their headquarters back and forth between Montreal and Mexico City as the situations changed within those areas. In other words, when stepped-up enforcement activities in the Montreal area increased their risks, the group would move down to Mexico City. When the Mexican authorities cracked down, the violators moved back to Montreal. This has been the pattern since about 1958. The actual smuggling of the bulk quantities of heroin was usually accomplished by one of two means. First involved the use of automobiles with hidden traps, and the second involved the use of couriers with cleverly constructed suitcases with hidden compartments. In many instances, they used planes, both private and commercial. There can be no doubt that the Mexican government is increasing its efforts to suppress the traffic in drugs throughout the country. They have also embarked on programs designated to eradicate the growing of marijuana and opium poppy plants. In view of the remote and inaccessible locations of these crops, it is a problem of great dimensions, and it involves the use of spotter planes and heavily armed military personnel equipped with flamethrowers. During the past 5 years, 7 Mexican officers have been killed in carrying out these programs. Since January 1963, the Bureau of Narcotics had several agents assigned to work with Mexican authorities on the entire problem. The results they have achieved to date are most significant. To further their allegations of organized crimes involvement in Mexico, the subcommittee would then call George H. Gaffney to testify. Gaffney, at the time, was the Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and would confirm the shift in drug routes from Montreal to Mexico. The following testimony transcripts would state, "The Chairman, I believe the burden of your testimony will be in respect to the traffic between Canada and the United States, Mr. Gaffney, and also Mexico." The Chairman, "Very well, you may proceed." Mr. Gaffney, Mr. Pera had touched down upon the sources of supply in France and Mexico and Canada, as with the United States, have been mentioned as the principal points of entry of heroin emanating from the clandestine laboratories in France. To mention Mexico first, the importance of Mexico stems back to the early days of World War II. At that time, when our traffickers in the United States were relying upon European sources, they suddenly found themselves cut off as a result of the distribution of the normal ocean-going traffic. Of course, I don't believe there was much in the way of transatlantic plane flights in those days. We found then that the mafia element in New York, particularly the younger members of what was then known as the 107th Street Mob, who later became very important in these various family groups of La Cosa Nostra, went down in the Mexican border area and established contact with Mexican sources of crude opium and managed to supply a limited quantity of crude opium and obtain supplies of limited quantities of crude opium and set up within the United States, particularly within the New York area, clandestine laboratories. The Chairman, when was that? Mr. Gaffney, this was during the war years. The Chairman, in the early 1940s? Mr. Gaffney, in the early 1940s, 1941, 1942, 1943, and so forth. The Chairman, for this period of time immediately after World War II, when the traffic flowed into New York Harbor, enforcement then took its toll on many of the operators in the field. The illicit operators? Mr. Gaffney, yes. There were several major conspiracy cases developed during the war years involving the 107th Street Mob, and they went to jail, a goodly number of them. There were conspiracy cases that I recall just from reviewing the files that had as many as 37 to 40 defendants in them. Unfortunately, in those days, the sentences that were meted out were so unrealistic that these people found themselves having served their terms and were back on the street by the time the case reports were written. The government and the police up there in New York found themselves having to cope with them all over again. What in effect they did was shift their entire operation from Montreal to Mexico. They were the same people, the Corsicans allied with the mafia distributors. They say around 1952, 1953, and 1954, the emphasis seemed to shift to Mexico City. They would bring the drugs in from France to Mexico City, and then bring them on up into the States. This is how the pattern has changed from time to time. When things would get too hot for them in Montreal, they would move down to Mexico. When things got too hot in Mexico, they would move back to Montreal. but the pattern has persisted. Going back for a minute into Mexico, to show you a pattern of the traffic as it shifted from Montreal to the same traffickers, we arrested a man in New York by the name of John Leggett, a French trafficker. His real name is John David. He came to the country in 1939 after having murdered a bank messenger in France. Chairman, what was his name? Mr. Gaffney. He went by the name of John Leggett. His real name was John David. At the time of his arrest in 1953, we found a lot of correspondences, names, addresses, and so forth. One particular letter that was found in his possession when arrested in April 1963 was a letter from Mexico City addressed to him under an assumed name, addressed to his apartment, inquiring about the prices of linen in New York. The letter was written in French and said, "If the prices are any good, you can communicate with me in the care of the restaurant Helena, Calle del Edme, Número 9, Mexico City." Our agents in New York looked at the letter and felt, well, perhaps this is a coded inquiry concerning the price of narcotics. Commencing in 1958, the emergence of Mexico as a source of supply became important. I don't mean to imply that Mexico was necessarily the producing agent in this instance, because quite a bit of heroin of Middle Eastern origin has come through here. Chairman, in other words, there may have been some of the French heroin that is coming in from Turkey by the way of Syria and so on? That is correct. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this video, please click the like button below and make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support the channel further, please hit the super thanks icon, which can be found below each video or in the comment section below. If anyone is interested in becoming a connected member, click the join button to gain access to rare pictures of organized crime figures, untold stories, and exclusive behind the scenes footage. Thank you. Now let's get back to Corruption Connection. Mr. Gaffney's testimony was corroborated by John E. Storer. Storer held the position of chief in the Bureau of Narcotics California Division. Storer would state, "Each year the drugs come through these ports along with 8 million automobiles, 30 million passengers and pedestrians, and thousands of trucks and common carriers loaded with millions of dollars in legitimate merchandise." Prior to 1940, Mexico produced no opium and manufactured no heroin. In 1950, Mexican heroin in California was commonplace, but drugs of Far Eastern and Middle Eastern origin were more prevalent. By 1960, veteran officers agreed that 75%, 3/4 of the heroin in California, came from Mexico. Today, in 1964, there is more heroin, more potent heroin, and cheaper heroin available in Mexico than ever before. The 107th Street Mob was considered a precursor for what the Mafia would later become, as it was the catalyst for the creation of both the Lucchese and Genovese crime families, as many of its members were originally a part of the 107th Street Mob. Some of the mob's infamous members included one of its leaders, Gaetano Tommy Lucchese, who would rise to become boss of his own crime family, which still bears his name to this day. Other members would include Ignacio Lupo the Wolf Saeta, Vincent Rayo, as well as future Lucchese boss Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, and future Genovese boss Benny Squint Lombardo. The report would further state, Narcotics Conspiracy Case SC-199 had its inception in the notorious East 107th Street area of East Harlem, New York City, where narcotics were sold and distributed in retail and wholesale lots to various traffickers who subsequently caused these narcotics to be introduced into local and interstate traffic. The narcotics received at the time by these important dealers were obtained in Mexico by the East 107th Street Mob through the aid of several Jewish racketeers. A portion of the narcotics purchased in Mexico by the 107th Street Mob was seized in Reno, Nevada. Tommy Lucchese, the leading member of the East 107th Street Mob, directed these activities but remained insulated from possible incrimination by delegating the implementation of these illicit operations to several of his lieutenants, such as John Ormento and Salvatore Santura, alias Tom Mix. At times, it was not possible to obtain the desired quantities of high-grain opium from Mexico. Consequently, these individuals covertly resorted to local purchases of huge quantities of acetic anhydride, which they soon converted into heroin in their clandestine heroin-producing laboratories located in the metropolitan New York area. They distributed this heroin in local and interstate commerce. The Jewish underworld element at the time controlled the market, while the Italian racketeers attended to the conversion of opium into heroin and the distribution of the finished product throughout the United States. Although I wasn't able to discover a direct source, it was rumored that one of the 107th Street Mob's Mexican suppliers was Enrique Diarte Escobar. It was also noted that there were Chinese merchants based out of Mexicali who would supply American traffickers with heroin. Based out of Tijuana, Diarte doubled as both a drug trafficker and policeman, establishing Tijuana's principal narcotics smuggling operation. With certain members strategically placed in California, like Charlie Big Nose LaGuardia, the 107th Street Mob secured a steady supply of heroin, creating a pipeline from Mexico to New York City. However, after a few years, officials became aware of Diarte's narcotics business and attempted to ensnare Diarte by getting him to cross the border with narcotics. Diarte was able to evade law enforcement and escape, ultimately being discovered a few days later after the bust, shot dead in a ditch on a ranch outside of Tijuana. Although I wasn't able to confirm this information, the death of Diarte may have been contributed to the mob's main man in Las Vegas, Bugsy Siegel, who at the time had sent emissaries down to Mexico in order to establish a narcotics connection and eliminate the competition. Diarte's death would mark the end of the 107th Street Mob's Mexican connection. So, are you familiar with the 107th Street Mob, the first mafia group to establish a Mexican connection? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. As always, I'm your host, Tony Hernandez, and this is Corruption Connection.